Examine the pattern of recent catastrophic infrastructure failures. In Kuwait, a targeted strike paralyzes a primary desalination plant. In Moscow, a critical wild berries logistics depot is destroyed. In Ukraine, hundreds of strikes dismantle combined heat and power plants. Geopolitical analysts categorize these events as isolated, conventional military engagements. That categorization ignores the physical consistency of the targets. These assets share a specific target profile across diverse climate zones. We are seeing the elimination of desert water generation, the destruction of temperate supply logistics, and the removal of continental winter thermal energy. This strategy focuses on survival substrate elimination, the calculated removal of the exact baseline resources, specifically water and heat, required to maintain biological viability in a targeted geography. By synchronizing these attacks, the transition targets the baseline metabolic requirements of the entire population, compressing the window for human survival on a global scale. Satellite imagery of the Kuwaiti desalination facility reveals the fragility of this survival window. In a desert climate, severing this single facility removes the population's primary source of drinkable water. Without active generation, municipal reserves deplete in a matter of days. A national-scale dehydration event begins the moment the pumps fail. The Moscow logistics strike achieves a similar outcome through the destruction of stored goods. By obliterating a facility of this magnitude, the attackers remove the physical buffer protecting the population from sudden scarcity. In Ukraine, the destruction of combined heat and power plants targets biological stress through temperature. Extreme cold forces human metabolic demand higher, while the frozen municipal grid simultaneously denies the population access to water. Executing these strikes across completely different climates prevents the global supply chain from reallocating resources. A thermal crisis in Europe cannot be mitigated if the logistical and fuel pipelines are simultaneously disrupted in Asia. Forensic analysis of these strikes confirms the macro trigger is now active. The environment itself has now been weaponized to systematically compress human survival windows down to their absolute unforgiving limit. To understand why infrastructure failure becomes immediately lethal, we have to examine the microscopic hardware circulating within the human microvasculature. The active component is the graphene oxide, or GO, rectenna. Within the body, this material exists in a nominal hydrophilic state. Hydrophilic properties cause the GO to bind tightly to water. Under normal hydration, these nanosheets remain dispersed and flexible, encased within a protective hydration shell of surrounding water molecules. This diagram illustrates the physics of the 2.4 GHz frequency band. Water molecules are polar and reorient in response to an electric field. At 2.4 GHz, the frequency matches the relaxation frequency of liquid water, causing maximal amazine absorption. The hydrated GO lattice harvests this radiation, coupling directly with ambient wireless fields. The rectenna converts this alternating current into direct current. This DC voltage powers a localized Bluetooth low-energy broadcast, carrying a unique MAC address. This tracking mechanism requires no internal battery. It is powered entirely by the saturation of ambient electromagnetic radiation present in the environment. Under stable infrastructural conditions, the hydrated human host acts as a living, self-powered antenna for a global surveillance mesh. When the infrastructure trigger halts the water supply, the biological environment shifts. Systemic dehydration begins. As the individual loses access to water, plasma volume drops and blood viscosity increases. Without sufficient water intake, the physics of the GO lattice undergo a phase shift. The stabilizing hydration shell is stripped away from the nanosheets. The surface chemistry of the GO sheets changes. The edges magnetically attract one another, causing the previously flexible sheets to stack and align. The mechanical properties of the material invert. The benign flexible particles aggregate into rigid, crystalline structures, nanoblades harder than steel. This is crystallization entropy, the threshold where a passive surveillance tool physically reconstructs into an execution mechanism due to water denial. The sharp GO crystals are forced by blood flow through the narrowest capillary beds. Because capillaries barely fit a single red blood cell, the atom-thick edges act as blades, systematically lacerating the delicate endothelial lining. The human body reacts to this massive internal trauma by hyperactivating the coagulation cascade, deploying clotting factors to patch the tears. Millions of microthrombi form simultaneously, completely occluding the vessel and stopping circulation. This systemic failure is a known medical condition, disseminated intravascular coagulation, or DIC. DIC presents a paradox of lethality. The widespread clotting blocks blood perfusion, starving organs of oxygen, while the massive clotting effort depletes the body's clotting resources, leading to uncontrollable internal hemorrhage. A human being can naturally survive a lack of water for several days. The geo-accelerated DIC cascade bypasses that timeline. The internal mechanical shredding compresses total system failure into a strict 48 to 72-hour window. This flowchart maps the complete killbox architecture. The sequence dictates the progression. Graphene oxide injection leads to Bli emitter activation, which routes biometric data through memory modules, up to cloud storage, and into AI surveillance analysis. This surveillance mesh functions using pre-existing commercial technology. Standard Bluetooth protocols and AI systems handle the data extraction and automated monitoring of the population. The macro infrastructure strikes in Kuwait and Moscow map directly back to this specific biological sequence. The destruction of fuel and water logistics functions as the designated trigger for the crystallization phase. Once the trigger is pulled, the hardware dictates an inescapable timeframe. The population has exactly 48 to 72 hours before organ failure becomes irreversible. The kinetic strikes in Kuwait, Russia, and Ukraine function as the environmental trigger engineered to activate the graphene oxide lattice inside the host. The lethality relies on thermodynamic certainty. It avoids complex chemical weapons, relying instead on inescapable global supply chain dependencies and the physical properties of water depletion. Centralized energy choke points dictate the speed of the dehydration cascade. When the fuel reserves fail, the pumps and treatment chemicals immediately halt. Once the water supply fails, the crystallization cascade requires no external input or remote command. The process is governed purely by internal thermodynamics and physics. The forensic reality is silent. The casualty event leaves no visible external wounds, allowing a technological extermination to be masked as a natural health collapse. The synchronized infrastructure denial currently underway confirms the coordinate strategy has reached terminal velocity. The transition is now complete.